I want to talk to you today about putting children's human rights at the heart of sport in Scotland, and definitely, as I say, two things that I am really, really passionate about. And something that I see we have a real opportunity to do here in Scotland at the moment. We've made great strides, but the fact, as Mary said, that we're about to make the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child a binding law in Scotland provides a real opportunity for us. It's a real catalyst to make sure that more children and young people are able to realise their rights to sport, enjoy the kind of physical, the mental, the psychological benefits of sport, and help to make sure that sport enables them to thrive and to realise their potential. I'm Juliet Harris, I'm director of Together. It's not the most well-known organisation, but we are an alliance of children's organisations, NGOs and academics that really push for all children's human rights to be respected all of the time. We do have a stall next door, and the wonderful Caitlin, if you want to wave, Caitlin, is here. She's our membership and events officer. And so if you want to find out more about becoming a member of Together, please do, because we would definitely welcome the involvement of all sports governing bodies to work with you to see how we can help you to embed children's human rights across all that you do. To prepare for today, I thought I would start by reading what children and young people have been saying about sport. And I looked at a report, it's actually from 2014. It was commissioned by the Scottish Government. They commissioned the Children's Parliament to look at what children and young people think about sport so that they could come up with a strategy for Scotland's sport for the next 10 years. And this is the quote that particularly made me laugh because I like running and it's definitely not about winning for me. But there was such strong views from children and young people about the benefits of sport that came across in this report that I think are as relevant now, 10 years on, from when those children and young people were first speaking. The children and young people who were involved in this report were into all kinds of sports. They were into dancing, they were into mountain biking, they were into volleyball, they were into scootering. I didn't know that was a sport. They were into golf. So it's a real kind of broad group of children and young people. And the overwhelming thing that they said is that they want sport to be fun. They also talked about their reliance on adults and how reliant they are on adults to teach them about sport, how reliant they are on adults to even find out about sports, which sports exist, open up opportunities for sports, and how they want to actually involve adults. They want adults to play with them. They want adults to get involved in sports. They also talked about the benefits to them. They talked about friendship. They talked about learning. They talked about excitement, the need for challenge. Mary was talking about kind of the risk-averse nature, perhaps, that sometimes adults might have. Children and young people were talking about the fact they quite like taking risks. They like being able to take risks in a safe environment. They like the feelings of achievement, and they like the feelings of health. So you can see that there are some really strong quotes from children and young people thinking that these children will actually be adults now. And so a boy, age 11, who says, how can we play sports if we don't know what they are? And he was talking very much about the fact there are so many sports out there that children don't get to find out about. In this report, children were also saying that at primary school, they don't get to take part in different sports. They might just do football, they might just do hockey. They don't get to find out about other ones. And so it really shows how dependent, from a really early age, children are on adults to realise their right to sport. So what does the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child actually have to do with any of this? Well, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is something that Scotland, through the UK, has been signed up to for over 30 years. And it articulates the rights of every child in Scotland, irregardless of their background, their circumstance, their parents. It's for every child under the age of 18 here in Scotland. There are 42 substantive rights within the UNCRC, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through absolutely every single one of them this morning because I think we'd still be here by lunchtime and definitely craving some coffee. But I think an important thing to reflect on with the UNCRC is that we mustn't just think about it in terms of education, which is historically can be what tends to happen. We need to think about it in all areas of children's lives. So even when we're thinking about sport, we also need to think about it in terms of transport. How do children and young people get to sports facilities? We need to think about it in terms of the environment and urban planning. How do we make sure that there are safe spaces where children and young people can go to enjoy their right to sport, to take part in sport? We even need to think about it in terms of adult services. In terms of adult services, what are we doing to support the family as a whole, to support children and young people who are involved in those adult services? So even if we're thinking about adult sports, what are we doing to inspire children and young people to get involved? So it's such an important thing to think about, is every area of a child's life. It's not just education, it's not sport, it's the whole of Scotland, it's all children and young people, and it's all areas of children and young people's lives. And we're very excited about this thing called UNCRC incorporation, but I think it's worth taking a step back and just reflecting on what we mean by UNCRC incorporation. And as Mary said, then the campaign for UNCRC incorporation was actually led by children and young people. It's been led by children and young people for well over 10 years. And these are children and young people who've recognised that children's rights, it's not enough to be something that we just think about. It's actually something that we need to do. It's something that we need to have embedded in law. And again, just to show how long this campaign has been going on, I've included quotes from here from children who are now adults. So children who are campaigning for children's rights to be in law back in 2013. It's where they were saying that rights should be part of the culture of life. And I cannot agree more. Rights, whilst they are legal, whilst they are enforced in law, it needs to be something that's part of the culture of life. Mary talked about the fact that children and young people can feel and recognise when their human rights aren't respected. And it's so important that actually adults feel and recognise as well when children's rights haven't been respected and take it upon themselves to do something about it. So UNCRC incorporation is actually about taking an international law, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and bringing it into domestic law, so making it binding in Scots law. So it's much like the Human Rights Act, for example, brings the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. Then the UNCRC Incorporation Act brings all those 42 rights within the UNCRC into Scots law, insofar as possible within the devolved competence, which is something that's far too complicated to go into today. So that's what UNCRC incorporation is. And again, the picture that I've included here, many of you might have seen it, but I just love it. And also, isn't there a governing body on trampolining? Oh, not in the room. I'm pretty certain there's a sports governing body on trampolining, so I wanted to put a trampoline in it. But children and young people drew this picture for us to say how they felt about their rights before incorporation, before making them binding in law. And they said to me, we know that we have a right to live free from poverty. We know we have the right not to be discriminated against. We know we have the right to adequate housing. We know we have the right to sport and to play. But often those rights just feel like clouds in the sky. They're things that we can't reach. And even if we balance on each other's shoulders, even if we bounce on a trampoline, we stand on a crane, those rights are things that are just clouds in the sky. And we want to see incorporation so that actually these rights are things that we can hold. These are things that we can claim. These are things that we realise in everyday lives rather than just being theoretical clouds in the sky. So that's the aim of UNCRC incorporation, and I'm delighted to say that the UNCRC incorporation bill was passed in December of last year, and it became an act when King Charles signed it off on the 16th of January, which is a date I won't forget because it's also my partner's birthday, so it's a doubly good day. And 16th of January, which means it commences on the 16th of July this year. So it means from the 16th of July this year, all those 42 rights are going to become binding in Scots law. It's important to think about the UNCRC Act in a kind of carrot and stick way. So I don't know if there are any lawyers in the room, but if you look at the Human Rights Act, it's very much about what you do when things go wrong. So it's how you take people to court if your rights have been breached. The UNCRC Incorporation Act is far more optimistic and positive than that. It's actually the carrot and the stick. So the carrot part of the UNCRC Act, you can tell I'm not a lawyer, the carrot part of the UNCRC Act is actually what can we do to make sure that we get things right from the outset? What can we do to make sure that children's rights aren't breached, that they are respected all of the time? So there are a number of measures within the bill that are proactive in promoting children's rights to actually prevent those breaches. However, we do know that breaches still happen, so it's essential that children and young people do have access to justice, that they do have access to courts, like we do through the Human Rights Act when things do go wrong. And we also know that having that kind of stick part of the UNCRC Incorporation Act actually focuses people's minds. People don't want to be taken to court for breaching children's rights, and so it does help people to really concentrate on the carrot side and getting things right from the outset. So when the UNCRC Act comes in, it means it will apply to all children in Scotland under the age of 18. It will have this carrot and stick side for it, and it means it will be across everything that we do. So remember, it's not just children's services, it's not just sport, it's transport, it's environment, it's planning. And I think so many of these issues are interrelated. And certainly when I think about access to sport, it really relates to transport and planning and urban environment. So I do see this as a real opportunity actually to open up more access to sport for more children and young people. The UNCRC Incorporation Act places duties on government, and that's all levels of government. So this is the Scottish Government, it's local authorities, it's health. But really importantly, it also places duties on those who are commissioned by government to deliver public services. And so if, as a governing body, you receive funding from Scottish Government to deliver services, if sports clubs receive money from government to deliver services, then actually the UNCRC Act will apply just as much to you as it will to the government, the First Minister, to health, to hospitals, education. So this is something that we all need to be aware of, mindful of, and maximise the opportunities that it offers. Like I say, it commences on the 16th of July next year, so there's time to get ready and there's plenty of guidance and support, so it's not something to worry about, it's something to get excited about. So it means that anybody who is carrying out services of a public nature has to act compatibly with the 42 rights within the UNCRC, as set out within the UNCRC Act. It means that children and young people or their representatives can enforce their rights through the courts if they think their rights have been breached. It gives powers to the Children and Young People's Commissioner and the Scottish Human Rights Commission to bring or intervene in court proceedings. I'm sure Nick, who's speaking after me, will be able to tell you more about that. And it also means that listed public authorities, including the Scottish Sports Council, Sports Scotland, have to report every 3 years, not just on what they've done to uphold children and young people's rights, but also on what they plan to do in the next 3 years. And importantly, when they're drawing those reports together, they need to involve children and young people and to hear and listen to what children and young people have to say. So the UNCRC Incorporation Act isn't something for other people, it's something for us, and it's an opportunity for us to make sure that more children and young people can be involved in sport. So what difference or what considerations do you really need to be thinking about in terms of the UNCRC Incorporation Act? Obviously, I can't take you through every single consideration, so I'll just give you a few kind of hints and tips now of what needs to be in your mind when you're really thinking about whether you're bringing a children's human rights approach to your work. I think, as Mary has said, there have been really great strides across the sporting community in Scotland to focus in on child protection, to focus in on making sure children and young people are safe when they're in sporting environments and able to take part in sports. So there's been this really strong focus on child protection, which has absolutely been necessary. But when we're looking at a children's rights approach, we need to be looking across what's known as the 3 Ps. So child protection is one aspect of that, but we also need to be looking at provision, and we also need to be looking at participation. So out of the 42 rights within the UNCRC, Some of them are participation rights, some of them are child protection rights, and others are provision rights. So it's absolutely essential in everything that you're doing that you're not just thinking about child protection, but you're thinking about provision. How can you make sure that you open up access to different groups of children and young people to participate in sport? How can you make sure that children and young people have what they need to participate in sport? How can you make sure that children and young people, whether that provision is in terms of transport or whether that provision is in terms of equipment, how can you make sure that we do everything that we can to ensure that provision is met? Participation, how can you make sure that children and young people are able to direct what they're doing in sport, inform what they're doing in sport? So much of what children and young people say that they enjoy about sport is being with their friends, being with their families, building those relationships, feeling like they're achieving something. How can we make sure that they really feel like they're able to shape their journey to explore different sports and develop in the way that fulfills their own potential? So making sure that we look at child protection as much as we do, keep that focus, but do look at participation and do look at provision as well. And again, it's really important to think about the general principles of the UNCRC, because again, obviously, the best interest principle is very well known. The focus on life, survival and development is about child protection and safety, but it's making sure on top of that that we really look at non-discrimination as well and equality in access to sport and children's participation. And when I say children's participation, I'm saying this purposefully, that it's not just young people, it's children, it's all ages of children and young people. Something that's important when we're thinking about non-discrimination and our approach using the UNCRC Act is to recognise that the provisions within the UNCRC Act are actually broader than some of the existing duties under the Equalities Act. So I think everybody will know that the Equalities Act contains protected characteristics that we need to think about when we're taking forward our work. And these are listed within the Equalities Act. But the UNCRC actually talks about other status. So you can see from our word cloud, and this is something that we did with children and young people, we asked them, who do you think, whose rights are most at risk? And they came up with a number of different groups of children and young people that aren't included in the Equalities Act that we do need to be thinking about when we're looking at provision of services for children around the UNCRC Act and around sports. And so, for example, things like young carers, refugee children, care experienced children and young people. Importantly, children living in poverty. What can we do in our day-to-day work to really help ensure that what we're doing is inclusive of these children and young people and they have equal opportunity to participate in sports? An important thing that I've looked at as I've been preparing for this presentation is a recent report that the Children's Parliament did for the Scottish Football Association. And I would recommend this as reading for everybody in this room because it's absolutely fascinating. So the Children's Parliament worked with the Scottish Football Association to really explore what children and young people's experiences were of taking part in Scottish football. It worked with children aged 8 to 18. It started with some in-depth in-person work with children and young people across 10 different settings. And it ended with a survey right across Scotland that 1,500 children and young people responded to. Interestingly, this was just last year, it was in the autumn of last year, and so many of the issues that came up in this report mirrored the ones that were reflected in the report that I spoke about 10 years earlier after the Commonwealth Games. So children and young people reflected on how football is fun, how it's an opportunity to meet their friends, how they want to be fit, they want to be healthy, they want to improve. But they also talked a lot about some of the challenges that were involved in their participation in football. They really reflected strongly on bullying. And when they were talking about bullying, they weren't just talking about bullying between children, they talked about bullying between adults and children as well. And they talked about sometimes adults being active active viewers of bullying taking place and doing nothing about it. They talked about gender equality in access to football. They talked about how sometimes girls and young women aren't able to participate in football, either through a lack of facilities or because they feel stereotyped, or again, because they feel bullied. And they talked about the impact of poverty. They talked about grounds being closed down in areas of higher social deprivation. They talked about not feeling safe in areas that they wanted to play in after school. Children from rural communities and from island communities talked about transport, how they wanted to take part in football, but they couldn't always get to where they wanted to play, how they were reliant on transport, or how their parents, their carers, couldn't necessarily afford it. And they talked about safety. And so it really identifies a lot of challenges that children and young people still feel need to be overcome in terms of their participation in football. And the reason I'd recommend it to everyone is I think this is just equally applicable to most sports across Scotland. I think the children and young people who've highlighted these challenges, I think that these challenges will be there across very many of the other sports that children and young people want to enjoy in Scotland. So the Scottish Football Association is using what they're learning from this to inform their strategy, inform their way forward. So is there somebody from the SFA here today? There must be. Yes. So yeah, a shout out really to listening for the fact that you're listening to children and young people, you're reacting to the views, you're preparing for the UNCRC Incorporation Act by looking at what children and young people think and really embedding that into the work that you're taking forward. So it's a really good example of what needs to be done to make sure that we're looking at the participation and the provision of services for children as well as child protection. I did tell you I'm not going to go through all of the UNCRC rights, but I have concentrated on the general principles. If I can just drop a few more in that I think are absolutely key for us to think about today. And I have to say, I sent the presentation through last night and I was reading it on the train thinking, yeah, I think I've got it about right. I've missed the right to health off. I don't know why. So, let me highlight. The right to health is Article 27 of the UNCRC, and it's not on this slide. And I would say that's a particularly relevant right to children's involvement in sport, particularly reflecting on the fact that the right to health is not just the right to physical health, it's the right to mental health. So we need to be thinking about children's mental and psychological needs as well as their physical needs as they're taking part in sports. We also need to be thinking about sometimes the negative impact that involvement in competitive sports can have on children and young people's right to health. I know that as a climber, for example, about some of the body issues that young female climbers have. From a very early age because they want to be lightweight because it hurts your fingers less when you're climbing. And so things like that, we need to think about the negative impact that involvement in sports can have on the right to health as well as the positive impact. And we need to do everything that we can to mitigate against that negative impact. So other UNCRC rights that I think is worth reflecting on is freedom of association. That's Article 15 of the UNCRC. Because what children and young people tell us about the importance of the social side of sport, of gathering with friends, being part of clubs, that's absolutely key to children's enjoyment of sport. So we need to be thinking about Article 15 when we're thinking about children's rights. We need to be thinking about the right to privacy, and I think this intersects as well with what I was saying about rights at risk. Sometimes you might need to know something as sports governing bodies about children and young people's health needs, about perhaps extra support that they might need, even about their socio-economic needs. Maybe they need help buying equipment and things like that. They have a right to privacy just as much as you do, and it's really important that that's respected. And whether that's medical records or whether that is financial support, that absolutely needs to be respected. Article 19, protection from harm. Like I've said, there's been great strides, I think, within the sporting community around that. And I think that's something to be hugely welcomed and applauded and also built upon. The right to aims of education. I love this right in the UNCRC because it talks about education being what's needed to help children and young people realise their full potential. It's not just about maths and science and history. It's about really making sure that children and young people grow up with respect for human rights, for dignity, for the natural environment, and it's seen as a holistic education. And I really think that actually participation in sport has got a really strong role to play in realising that right to education. And then the final one, which is probably the most well-known, perhaps apart from Article 12, is Article 31. Article 31 is the right to play, but it also does include the right to sport, recreation and leisure. And something that quite often gets missed, it also includes the right to rest. Children and young people don't have to be doing something all of the time. And I think that's absolutely key. It's almost like a right to be bored. Children and young people are allowed to be bored sometimes. There's the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child writes what's known as general comments to help you take forward different aspects of the UNCRC. So for the more geeky among you, I would recommend that you have a look at these general comments because they're rather useful. There is a general comment on UNCRC Article 31 on the right to play. And it's slightly contradictory because at the beginning it says this isn't about sport and will make very little reference to sport. But as you read through it, it actually talks a lot about children's involvement in sport. It talks a lot about how you can ensure inclusivity in sports provision. It talks a lot about how you can make sure that different groups have opportunities, you overcome challenges in terms of transportation, access to sports. So I would recommend having a look at that general comment if you want to learn more about what a rights-based approach to access to sport looks like. Another area of help, another area of help for UNCRC taking it forward is looking at the concluding observations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And this is like Scotland's to-do list for the UNCRC. So the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child last year spoke to children and young people from Scotland who themselves had spoken to lots more children and young people across Scotland and asked what were the key things that need to be taken forward. And the committee have come out with what we're calling a to-do list for Scotland of 200 recommendations that need to be taken forward. I think these are things that we need to be looking at, again, around priorities in taking forward the UNCRC Act. And so it highlights things like sufficient time to take part in sport, about inclusivity, age appropriateness, inclusion of children with disabilities, rural areas, the issue of transportation and play spaces. So this is like our to-do list. So it's certainly something that's worth taking forward when you're working out what your governing body should be doing in relation to the UNCRC Act. So there are plenty of resources. You're not on your own. Like I said, you can join together to become a member. We have a State of Children's Rights report that we published back in 2022 in anticipation of the UNCRC Incorporation Act, where we've got lots of different case studies of good practice, of how to take different elements forward of what you need to do for UNCRC incorporation. So whether you're looking at inclusivity, children whose rights are most at risk, whether you're looking at how to raise awareness of children's rights within your sport, whether you're looking at children's participation in decision-making, or whether you're looking at impact assessments, please do refer to our State of Children's Rights report because we can provide you with some insight as to how to take these things forward. I wanted to finish with a quote from the Children's Parliament. I don't think they were actually specifically speaking to the sports governing bodies when they came up with this quote, but I thought it was particularly relevant. They were talking about sport, obviously, never give up. You can push yourself to reach the stars. But I actually think that's a good challenge for us involved in sport, for all of us who are passionate about sport. We shouldn't give up. We shouldn't be intimidated by the UNCRC Incorporation Act. We shouldn't think of it as being something more that we have to do, more legal obligations, because actually this is the framework that we need to make sure that we do reach for the stars, to make sure that we do really increase opportunities for children and young people to get involved in sport, children and young people from all backgrounds, all areas, all circumstances. So this is a challenge from a child, but I'd like to pass that challenge on to you. So don't give up, reach for the stars, really harness the potential of making children's rights in law, and think about what we can do to move the conversation on from not just thinking about child protection, but thinking about child's participation and how we provide sports, facilities, services, involvement to all children and young people across Scotland. Lots of resources here. We'll circulate the slides afterwards so you can hyperlink on these and find out more. But I think we'll move quickly on to the conversation starters, which I think we've got about 10 minutes to do. Apologies. But I've framed these conversation starters. You've got facilitators at each of your tables. And I've framed the conversation starters to have the carrot and the stick. So what can we do to get things right from the outset? I'd love to have a look more about what you think you can do to support inclusive access to sport as a right for all children and young people. And secondly, the stick side, if things do go wrong, what can we do within the sporting community to make sure that children and young people are able to complain, that they're able to raise worries about their rights in sport, or that there's strong relationships with parents and carers to make this happen. These conversation starters, again, have come from children and young people who've been involved in the Scottish Football Association research. So these are things that children and young people want the SFA to discuss, so I thought, let's all discuss that today. So if I can pass you over to the facilitators at your table and move on to those conversation starters.